we are what the future is for women.
Yeah.
And I look at having my daughters.
She has been famous for more than 4 decades, married 3 times, and has spent the last several years doing something she avoided for most of her career, talking honestly about what actually happened behind the headlines. At 62, Demi Moore is no longer performing the role of Hollywood's most photographed ex-wife. She is narrating her own story on her own terms, and the version she tells is far more complicated than the tabloid shorthand of cougar and scandal that followed her for over a decade. Demi Gwines was born in Roswell, New Mexico on November 11, 1962. Her childhood was unstable almost from the start. Her biological father left before she was born, and the family Moore grew up and moved constantly, chasing work and outrunning debt. Both of her parents struggled with alcohol. In her 2019 memoir, Inside Out, Moore wrote candidly about a childhood scarred by instability, addiction in the household, and sexual assault she experienced as a teenager, one of the most difficult revelations in the book. She also described witnessing her mother's suicide attempt as a child, an experience that forced her into a caretaking role long before she was equipped for it. By 16, Moore had dropped out of school and was supporting herself with modeling work and odd jobs. At 17, she married rock musician Freddie Moore, a decision she later admitted came less from love than from a need to escape her chaotic home life. She kept his surname professionally even after their divorce 4 years later. It became the name the world would come to know her by. Her break came in the early 1980s when she landed a role on the soap opera General Hospital, beating out roughly 1,000 other actresses for the part. It was a modest paycheck for a major opportunity, and it opened the door to the role that would define her early career. Jules in 1985's St. Elmo's Fire, one of the films that cemented the so-called Brat Pack, a term coined by the press for the cluster of young stars, Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, Judd Nelson, Andrew McCarthy, and others, who dominated youth-oriented Hollywood cinema in the mid-1980s. Off-screen, Moore was privately fighting substance abuse during this period. Director Joel Schumacher reportedly gave her an ultimatum to get sober or lose the role, and the production arranged support to help her stay clean during filming. She got sober and stayed that way for close to 2 decades. The 1990s made Demi Moore one of the highest-paid actresses in the world and one of the most publicly scrutinized. Ghost 1990 made her a household name and one of the era's defining romantic leads. A Few Good Men 1992 put her opposite Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson in a major courtroom drama. But it was the films that followed that turned her into a lightning rod for public debate. Indecent Proposal 1993 asked audiences whether a married woman would accept $1 million to sleep with a stranger, and it made nearly $267 million worldwide on a fraction of that budget. It also drew real criticism at the time. Some feminist commentators argued the film reduced a woman to a transaction, and Moore later said the backlash that followed was among the hardest stretches of her career. She kept working through it, and by the mid-1990s, she was making headlines again for 2 films that pulled her public image in opposite directions. Striptease, 1996, for which she was reportedly paid $12.5 million, making her briefly the highest-paid actress in Hollywood, and G.I. Jane, 1997. In which she shaved her head on camera and trained intensively to play the first woman to attempt Navy SEAL training. Moore herself later reflected that playing an overtly sexualized character upset some audiences, while playing a hardened soldier upset others, a neat summary of the contradictory expectations placed on famous women at the time. In her memoir, she connected this period of intense public scrutiny to a worsening struggle with body image and substance use that had been simmering since her 20s. Moore met Bruce Willis in 1987 while she was engaged to actor Emilio Estevez. The relationship moved fast. The two were married within months in a characteristically impulsive Las Vegas ceremony. Willis was riding the success of Die Hard. Moore was becoming one of the biggest female stars in the industry. They had 3 daughters together, Rumor, born 1988, Scout, 1991, and Tallulah, 1994, and for over a decade were one of Hollywood's most visible couples. Their careers and their differing visions of family life eventually pulled them apart. They separated in 1998 after 11 years of marriage. What followed was unusual for a high-profile Hollywood split. The two remained close, co-parented their daughters without much public conflict, and continued showing up for each other for decades afterward, at each other's later weddings, at family milestones, and more recently, in the public support Moore has shown as Willis has faced a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia, announced by his family in 2023. Moore has spoken openly about staying involved in his care and continuing to spend time with him and his wife, Emma Hemming Willis. In 2003, at the New York premiere of Charlie's Angels, Full Throttle, 40-year-old Demi Moore met 25-year-old Ashton Kutcher. In her memoir, Moore described the instant, almost disorienting sense of connection she felt talking to him, writing that despite the 15-year age gap, it didn't feel like an obstacle to either of them from the very first conversation. The relationship moved with the same speed that had characterized her marriage to Willis. Within weeks, Kutcher had met her daughters and her ex-husband. Kutcher proposed after only a few months together, and the two moved in together shortly after. The tabloid press seized on the age gap almost immediately. When the couple made their public debut, photographers reportedly swarmed the event in numbers rarely seen even for A-list romances, and outlets speculated that six-figure sums were being offered for a single photo of the two kissing. Late-night hosts built recurring bits around the relationship, and the word cougar, already in circulation, became a mainstream tabloid fixture with Moore frequently cited as its most famous example. Moore later addressed the mockery head-on, appearing in a 2005 Saturday Night Live sketch in old age makeup that poked fun at the exact stereotype the press had built around her. Moore and Kutcher married in a small private ceremony at their Beverly Hills home in September 2005, incorporating a Kabbalah wedding canopy that reflected their shared interest in the practice. Willis attended. Moore's 3 daughters read letters to Kutcher during the ceremony, and he later gave each of them a bracelet as a gesture toward the blended family they were forming. By all accounts, Kutcher took an active role as a stepfather, attending school events, and in Moore's own later description of the relationship, working to build genuine bonds with 3 teenagers who were adjusting to a new adult in their mother's life. That adjustment wasn't seamless. Moore's youngest daughter, Tallulah, has written publicly about finding it confusing at first to accept Kutcher in a parental role, and rumor has spoken about the strangeness of watching her mother date someone close to her own age. Kutcher, for his part, said in later interviews that he came to see his relationship with the girls as something that added to his life rather than complicating it. In 2005, several months into a pregnancy, Moore and Kutcher lost a baby girl, whom they had already named. Moore was in her 40s at the time. She later wrote that she blamed herself for the loss and struggled for years with the grief. It was a devastating blow to a relationship that had, until then, moved almost entirely on adrenaline and momentum, and both later described it as the beginning of a much harder chapter. In her memoir, Moore wrote candidly about what happened next, repeated rounds of IVF that never resulted in another pregnancy, and a period in which she began drinking again and using prescription painkillers to cope with the grief, a serious setback for someone who had been sober for close to 2 decades. She also wrote about the strain the loss put on her marriage, describing Kutcher as someone who tried to be supportive, but who, in her account, struggled to fully connect with the depth of what she was going through. The couple sought counseling and turned to their shared interest in Kabbalah for support, including a trip to Israel, but the underlying tension didn't resolve. One of the more startling revelations in Inside Out was Moore's account of the couple experimenting with threesomes at Kutcher's request, in what she described as an effort to keep the relationship exciting and to be the kind of partner she believed he wanted. She wrote that the arrangement left her feeling ashamed rather than closer to him, and that it blurred boundaries in ways that, in her telling, later gave Kutcher an excuse to justify infidelity. The marriage collapsed publicly in the fall of 2011. Reports at the time detailed an incident on the couple's 6th wedding anniversary, in which Kutcher was said to have spent the night with a woman he had met previously. Moore has said she learned about the affair not from Kutcher directly, but from a Google alert while getting ready for a red carpet appearance. She has also said this wasn't an isolated incident, that she later learned of an earlier instance of infidelity as well. Kutcher, according to Moore's account, pointed to the couple's earlier experimentation with threesomes as a factor that had blurred the lines in their relationship, a framing that Moore has said only deepened how betrayed she felt. Just days after the story broke publicly, the two were photographed together at an event connected to Thorn, the anti-human trafficking foundation they had co-founded, an appearance Moore has since described as one of the most difficult things she's had to do in public. Moore announced their separation in November 2011. The divorce process dragged on for roughly 2 years. Kutcher formally filed in December 2012, and the divorce was finalized in November 2013. Both have separately described the end of the marriage as one of the most painful periods of their lives. Moore has spoken about how deeply it damaged her sense of self-worth, and Kutcher has said in later interviews that the divorce made him feel, in his words, like he had failed. The years immediately following the divorce were the darkest of Moore's adult life. She had been sober for nearly 2 decades before her relationship with Kutcher began unraveling, and in the aftermath of the divorce, she relapsed seriously. In January 2012, paramedics were called to her home after she reportedly had a seizure at a party, having been using synthetic cannabis and inhaling nitrous oxide. It was a public, frightening low point, and it marked the beginning of roughly 3 years in which, by her own later account, her addiction escalated significantly, alongside serious struggles with disordered eating and body image. That period took a heavy toll on her relationship with her 3 daughters. All 3 have spoken, most notably during a 2019 episode of the Facebook Watch series Red Table Talk, about how frightening it was to watch their mother change during this time, and about a period of roughly 3 years in which they were largely estranged from her. Tallulah, the youngest, has spoken about the anxiety of that period and her own subsequent struggles, which she has said included time in treatment. Rumor has described the anger and heartbreak of feeling like her mother's addiction had taken something from her. Scout has talked about feeling abandoned. In September 2012, Moore entered treatment at a residential facility in Utah, a necessary step, by her own account, toward rebuilding both her health and her relationship with her children. The reconciliation didn't happen overnight. It began in November 2015, when Tallulah, newly out of her own treatment, reached out to her mother, and Moore flew to see her immediately. Over the following years, the family worked through their estrangement in therapy, in family counseling, and eventually at a retreat in Arizona in 2017 that Moore has credited as a turning point. By her 60th birthday in 2022, the relationship had healed enough that her daughters marked the occasion by getting matching tattoos of the word mother in Moore's own handwriting, a gesture Moore has spoken about publicly as one of the most meaningful of her life. Moore's public reflections in recent years have shifted noticeably in tone. In interviews around her 2024 film The Substance, the role that brought her a Golden Globe win, an Oscar nomination, and some of the best reviews of her career, she has spoken repeatedly about no longer needing a romantic relationship to feel complete. She has described her approach to dating now as being driven by choice rather than by any sense of lack, and has joked publicly, including on The Tonight Show, about being contentedly single. She dated chef Daniel Hum for several months in 2022 before that relationship ended. She has not confirmed a public relationship since, despite periodic tabloid speculation, including rumors linking her to actor Andrew Garfield after the two shared a moment on stage at the 2025 Golden Globes, which neither has addressed directly. She has remained close with Bruce Willis and his wife, showing up for family celebrations and speaking candidly and supportively about his health as his condition has progressed. Her relationship with Kutcher, by contrast, has been more distant since the divorce, though both have spoken about the marriage with less bitterness as time has passed, Kutcher acknowledging in a 2023 interview that the divorce affected him deeply, and Moore describing, in her memoir, a measure of gratitude for what the relationship taught her, even amid everything that went wrong. What's changed most, by Moore's own account, isn't any single relationship, it's her relationship with herself. At 62, after 3 marriages, a very public collapse, and a rebuilding of trust with the 3 daughters who nearly lost her, she describes herself not as someone waiting for the next chapter of a love story, but as someone who has finally stopped needing one to feel whole.